Seacrow Island, Astrid Lindgren. A day in June. If you go down to the quay in Stockholm on a summer morning and see a little white boat called Seacrow, lying there, that is the right boat to take, and all you have to do is to go on board, for at 10 o'clock precisely she will ring her bell for departure and back out of the quay. She is now setting out on her usual trip, which ends at the island that lies the farthest out in the sea of all the islands in the Stockholm archipelago. Seacrow is a purposeful, energetic little steamer, and she has made this journey 3 times a week in summer and once a week in winter for more than 30 years, although she is probably quite unconscious of the fact that she plows through waters different from any others on the face of the earth. She crosses wide expanses of open water and steams through narrow channels, past hundreds of green islands and thousands of gray, bare rocks. She does not go fast, and the sun is low when at last she reaches the quay at Seacrow Island, the island which has given her its name. She has no need to go any farther, for there is only the open sea beyond, with its bare rocks and its islands where nobody lives except eider ducks, gulls, and other sea birds. But there are people on Seacrow Island, not many at most, 20, that is, in the winter, but in the summer there are the summer visitors as well. Just such a family of summer visitors was aboard Seacrow one day in June a few years ago. It consisted of a father and his 4 children, and their name was Melkerson. They lived in Stockholm, and none of them had been to Seacrow Island before, and so they were very excited, especially Melker, the father. Seacrow Island, he said, I like the name. That was why I took the house. Malin, his 19-year-old daughter, looked at him and shook her head. What a scatterbrained father she had. He was almost 50, but he was as impulsive as a child and more irresponsible than his own sons. Now he was standing there as excited as any child on Christmas Eve, expecting them all to be wildly enthusiastic about his idea of taking a summer cottage on Seacrow Island. It's like you, Daddy, said Malin. It's exactly like you to take a cottage on an island which you have never even seen just because you like the name. That's what I would have thought everybody did, Melker replied. He thought for a moment and then said, or perhaps one has to be an author and be more or less crazy to do a thing like that. Only a name, Seacrow Island. Perhaps other people would have gone and looked at the place before taking it. Lots would have, but not you. Well, never mind, I'm on my way there now, said Melker cheerfully, and he gazed around him with his gay blue eyes. He saw all the things he loved most: the pale waters, the islands and reefs, the old gray rocks, the shore with its old houses and jetties and boathouses. He felt as if he wanted to stretch out his hand and caress them. Instead he grasped Johann and Nicholas by the nape of the neck. Do you realize how beautiful it all is? Do you realize how lucky you are to live in the midst of all this for a whole summer? Johann and Nicholas said they did realize it, and Pelle said he realized it too. Well, why don't you shout for joy then, said Melker. Would you mind me asking for a spot of jubilation. "How do you do it?" Pele asked. He was only 7 years old and could not show joy to order. "You yodel," said Melker, and laughed. Then he tried to yodel a little himself, and all his children giggled obediently. "You sound like a cow mooing," said Johann, and Malin remarked, "Wouldn't it be better, just to be on the safe side, to wait until we've seen the cottage before you start crowing?" Melker did not think so. The agent said the cottage was wonderful, and one has to believe what people say. He assured me that it was an old, homey, delightful cottage. "If only we could get there soon," said Pele. "I want to see the cottage now." Melker looked at his watch. "In an hour's time, my boy. By that time we shall all be very hungry. And guess what we shall be doing then?" "Eating," suggested Nicholas. "Exactly. We'll sit outside the house in the sunshine and eat the wonderful meal that Malin will have cooked for us. We shall be having it on the green grass, of course, and we will just sit there and feel that summer has come." "Oh," said Pele, "I'll soon be shouting for joy." But then he decided to do something else. His father had said there was an hour to go, and there must still be things he could do aboard this boat. He had done most of the exploring. He had climbed up all the companionways and looked in all the exciting corners and cupboards. He had put his nose into the pilot's room and been chased away. He had tried to get up to the captain on the bridge and had been sternly ordered off. He had stood looking down into the engine room, watching all the machinery as it went around and round. He had drunk lemonade and eaten rolls, and had thrown bits of his roll to the hungry gulls. He had chatted with almost everybody on board. He had tried to see how fast he could run from one end of the boat to the other, and he had got in everybody's way at every stopping place as the crew threw baggage ashore. Now he began to look around for something new, and it was then that he discovered a couple of passengers he had not noticed before. Far astern he saw an old man sitting with a little girl, and on the seat beside the girl was a cage with a raven in it, a live raven. That made Pele hurry, for he loved all living creatures, everything that moved, flew or crawled beneath the sky, every bird, fish, and four-footed animal. Dear little animals, he called them all, and he included frogs, wasps, grasshoppers, beetles, and other small insects. But now here was a raven, a real live raven. The little girl smiled at him, a sweet, toothless smile, as he stopped in front of the cage. "Is this your raven?" he asked, and poked a finger between the bars to try to stroke the bird. But this was a mistake, for the raven immediately pecked at his finger, and he hurriedly drew it back. "Be careful," said the little girl. "Yes, he is my raven, isn't he, Grandpa?" The old man beside her nodded. "Yes, of course, it's Stina's raven," he explained to Pele. "At any rate, while she's with me on Seacrow Island." "Do you live on Seacrow Island?" said Pele, delighted. "I'm going to live there too this summer. I mean, Father and I are going to live on Seacrow Island." The old man looked at him in an interested way. "Are you indeed? Then I suppose it's you who have taken the old carpenter's cottage." Pele nodded eagerly. "Yes, it's us." "Is it nice there?" The old man put his head on one side and looked as if he were thinking. Then he broke into a funny little laugh. "Yes, it's nice, but of course it depends on what you like." "What do you mean?" asked Pele. The old man laughed again. "Well, either you like it when it rains in through the roof, or you don't." "Or you don't," came as a sort of echo from the little girl. "I don't." Pele grew rather thoughtful. He must tell Daddy that, but not just now. Now he wanted to look at the raven. It must be fun to have a raven, because everybody would want to come and look at it, especially a big boy like him. Of course, Stina was only a little girl, at most 5 years old, but Pele was willing to put up with her as a friend for the sake of the raven, at any rate until he had found something better. "I'll come to see you one day," he said kindly. "Which house do you live in?" "In a red one," said Stina, which was a lead, but not much more. "You can ask where old man Soderman lives," said her grandfather. "Everyone knows it." The raven blustered about in its cage and seemed very restless. Pele had another try at poking in his finger, but the bird pecked him again. "He's very wise," said Stina. "The wisest bird in all the world, Grandpa says." Pele thought this was boasting, as neither Stina nor her grandfather could possibly know which bird was the wisest in the world. "My grandma has a parrot," said Pele, "and she can say, 'Go to blazes.'" "There's nothing difficult in that," said Stina. "My grandmother can say that too." Pele laughed loudly. "It isn't my grandma who says it, it's the parrot." Stina did not like being laughed at. She was offended. "You should say what you mean then," she said crossly. She turned her head away and looked out over the rail. She did not want to talk to Pele any more. "Goodbye," said Pele, and went off to find his scattered family. He found Johann and Nicholas on the upper deck, and as soon as he saw them he knew that something was wrong. Both of them looked so gloomy that Pele felt anxious. Had he done something he shouldn't have done? "What is it?" he asked. "Look over there," said Nicholas, and pointed with his thumb. Leaning against the rail a little farther away stood Malin, and beside her a tall young man in a light blue polo-necked sweater. They were chatting and laughing together, and the boy in the sweater was looking at Malin. Malin, as if he had just found a beautiful little nugget of gold where he least expected it. "Here we go again," said Nicholas. "I thought it would be better when we got away from town." Johann shook his head. "Don't you believe it. If you put Malin on a rock in the middle of the Baltic, there'd be some boy or other swimming out to the rock within 5 minutes." Nicholas glared at the polo-necked sweater. "We ought to put up a notice beside her, 'Anchorage forbidden.'" Then he looked at Johann, and they both laughed. They did not really mind when anyone began to pay attention to Malin, which, according to Johann, happened about once every quarter of an hour. They were not really serious, but in spite of it all, they were secretly a little anxious. What if Malin fell in love one fine day and it all ended in an engagement and marriage and that sort of thing? "How would we get on without Malin?" Pele would say, and that was what they all thought and felt, for Malin was the family's anchor and support. Ever since the day their mother had died when Pele was born, Malin had been like a mother to all the boys, including Melker, a childish and very unhappy little mother for the first few years, but by degrees more and more capable of wiping their noses, washing, scolding, and baking, as she herself described it. "But you really only scold when you really have to," Pele always maintained. "Usually you are as soft and kind and good as a rabbit." Until recently Pele had not understood why Johann and Nicholas had been so against Malin's admirers. He had felt absolutely sure that Malin would go on belonging to the family forever. No matter how many polo necks circled around her, it was Malin herself who had disturbed his peace of mind. It happened when Pele was in bed one night trying to go to sleep. Malin was in the bathroom next door and was singing a song, which finished. She left school, got married, and had a family. Left school, yes, that was just what Malin had done, and then he supposed you just waited for the rest. Now he understood what would happen. Malin would marry, and they would be left all alone with Miss Nilsson, who came for 4 hours a day and then went. It was an unbearable thought, and Pele rushed in despair to his father. "Daddy, when will Malin get married and have a family?" he asked in a trembling voice. Melker looked surprised. He had not heard that Malin had any plans of that sort, and he did not realize that it was a question of life and death to Pele. "When is it going to happen?" Pele insisted. "That day and hour must remain hidden from us," joked Melker. "There's no need for you to worry about it, son, but Pele has worried about it ever since. Not all the time, of course, or even every day, but now and then on special occasions, like now, for instance." Pele stared toward Malin and the polo-necked sweater. As a matter of fact, they were just saying goodbye, because the young man was getting off at the next stop. "Goodbye, Krister," shouted Malin, and the sweater shouted back, "I'll come over with my motorboat one day and look you up." "You'd better not," muttered Pele angrily, and he decided to ask his father to put up one of those notices Nicholas had talked about, "Anchorage Forbidden," on the jetty at Seacrow Island. Obviously it would have been easier to have Malin to themselves in peace if she had not been so pretty. Pele realized that, not that he had looked at her particularly, but he knew she was pretty. Everybody said so. They thought that fair hair and green eyes like Malin's were very pretty. No doubt the polo-necked sweater thought so too. "Who was that?" asked Johann when Malin came over to the boys. "No one in particular, just someone I met at a party the other day. Quite nice." "You be careful," said Johann. "Write those words in your diary in capital letters." For Malin was not the daughter of an author for nothing. She wrote too, but only in her secret diary. In it she gave free rein to all her secret thoughts and dreams, and described all the exploits of the Melkerson boys, including Melker's. "You wait until I publish my secret diary, then you'll all be laughing on the other side of your faces." "Ha ha, you'll come out of the worst of anyone," Johann assured her. "I'm sure you're careful to mention all your sheiks in the right order." "Keep a list so you'll never forget any of them," suggested Nicholas. "Olaf the 14th, Karl the 15th, Lennart the 16th, Johann the 17th. It'll be a lovely little list." And Johann and Nicholas were convinced that the polo-necked sweater would be Krister the 18th. "I would like to know how she describes him in her diary," said Nicholas. "A boy with very short hair," suggested Johann. "Generally foul and sloppy." "That's only what you think," said Nicholas. But Malin did not write a word about Krister the 18th in her diary. He got off at his stop and left no lasting impression, for only a quarter of an hour later Malin had a much more important meeting, which made her forget everything else. It was then the boat arrived at the next jetty, and she saw Seacrow Island for the first time. Of this meeting she wrote, "Malin, Malin, where have you been so long? This island has been lying here waiting for you calmly and quietly for such a long time, with its little boathouses, its old village street, its jetties and fishing boats, and all its beauty, and you have not even known of its existence. Isn't that dreadful? I wonder what God thought when he made this island. I will have a little bit of everything, I expect, he thought. I will have bare gray rocks, green trees, oaks and birch trees, meadows with flowers. Yes, the whole island will be adrift with red roses and white hawthorn on the June day, 1,000 million years ahead when Malin Melkerson arrives. Yes, dear Johann and Nicholas, I know what you would think if you ever read this. Must you be so conceited? But I am not being conceited. I am only glad that God made Seacrow Island just as it is and not in any other way, and that he then thought of placing it, like a jewel, farthest out in the sea, where it has remained in peace just as he first created it, and that he has allowed me to come here. Melker had said, "You'll see all the islanders will come down to the quay to welcome us, will be a sensation." But it was not quite like that. It was pouring rain when the steamer arrived, and on the quay stood one solitary little person and a dog. This person was female and about 7 years old. She stood absolutely still, as if she had grown up out of the quay. The rain poured down on her, but she did not move. It seemed almost as if God had made her as part of the island, thought Mullen, and had put her there to be the ruler and guardian of the island to all eternity. "I've never felt so small," wrote Mullen in her journal, "as I did when I walked down the gangplank in the streaming rain under the child's gaze, carrying all my luggage. Her eyes seemed to take in everything. I thought she must be the spirit of Seacrow Island, and as if we should not be accepted by the island if we were not accepted by that child. And so I said, as sweetly as I could, as one does to little children, 'What's your name?' To Jorvin," she said. "Just that. And your dog?" I said. She looked me straight in the eye and asked calmly, "Do you want to know if he's my dog or what his name is?" "Both," I said. "He is my dog, and his name is Bosun," she said, and it was as if a queen had deigned to present her favorite animal. And what an animal! He was a Saint Bernard, the biggest one I've ever seen in my life. He was just as majestic as his owner, and I began to wonder whether all the creatures on this island were of the same breed and very superior to us humble beings from the city. But then a friendly soul arrived, who turned out to be the island's shopkeeper. He seemed to be a normal human being, for he welcomed us to Seacrow Island, and told us that his name was Nissi Gronkvist, but then he said, rather surprisingly, "Go home, Jorvin," to the majestic child. Just imagine, he dared command her, and he was actually her father. But his command did not have much effect. "Who said so?" asked the child sternly. "Did Mummy?" "No, I say so," said her father. "Then I won't go home," said the child. "I'm here to meet the boat." As the shopkeeper was busy checking his goods from the boat, he had no time to deal with his obstreperous daughter, so she stood there watching while we collected our belongings. We must have been a sorry sight just then, and nothing escaped her, for I felt her eyes on us as we set off toward Carpenter's cottage. There were other eyes watching us besides Jorvin's, beside the curtains of the windows all along the street. Eyes were looking out at us as we trailed along. It was pouring rain, and even Father began to look rather thoughtful. When it was coming down at its very hardest, Pele said, "Daddy, did you know that it rains in through the roof of Carpenter's cottage?" Daddy stopped dead in the middle of a puddle and asked, "Who says?" "Old man Soderman," said Pele, and it sounded as if he were speaking of an intimate friend. Daddy pretended to be quite indifferent. "Oh, I see. Old man Soderman, whoever this prophet of woe may be, says so. And of course old man Soderman knows, although the agent said nothing of the sort to me." "Didn't he know?" I said. "Didn't he say it was a pleasant old summer residence, particularly when it rained, because then there was a delightful little swimming pool in the middle of the living room?" Daddy gave me a long look, but did not answer, and then we arrived. "Hello, Carpenter's cottage," said Daddy. "Allow me to introduce the Melkerson family, Melker and his poor little children." It was a red one-story home, and the moment I saw it I had no doubt at all that it did rain in through the roof. but I liked it. I liked it from the very start. Daddy, on the other hand, was horrified. I don't know anyone who goes from one extreme to the other as quickly as he does. He stood quite still and stared despondently at the summer cottage he had rented for himself and his children. "What are you waiting for?" I said. "Nothing's going to change it." So he took heart and we all went in. Carpenter's cottage. No one in the family ever forgot that first evening in Carpenter's cottage. "Ask me whenever you want," said Melker afterwards, "and I will tell you exactly what it was like. A moldy, smelly, icy cold bed linen, Mullen with that little frown between her eyes, which she thinks I never notice, and me with a lump of anxiety in my chest. Had I done something absolutely crazy? But the boys were as happy as squirrels and rushed in and out. I remember that, and I remember the blackbird singing in the white beam tree outside the cottage, and the waves lapping against the jetty, and how quiet it was. And I was suddenly filled with wild excitement and thought, no, Melker, you haven't done anything crazy this time. This is something good, something really wonderful, something tremendously good. But of course there was that old musty smell, and then you lit the kitchen stove," said Malin. "Do you remember that?" But Melker did not remember. He said, "That stove doesn't look to me as if it were meant for cooking," said Malin, letting all her parcels and bags slide onto the kitchen floor. The stove was the first thing she had seen on coming in. It was rusty and looked as if it had not been used since the turn of the century. But Melker was encouraging. "Those old stoves are fantastically good. It only needs a little handling and I'll fix it. But let's look at the rest of the house first." There was something of the turn of the century about the whole of Carpenter's cottage, a very dilapidated old cottage. The tenants of many summers had not treated it well, but long ago it must have been a cherished and well cared for craftsman's house, for even in decay it had something wonderfully homey about it, which everyone felt. It'll be fun living in this old dump," said Pele, and giving Malin a hasty hug, he rushed after Johann and Nicholas to see what they were finding in the attic. "Carpenter's cottage," said Malin. "What sort of carpenter lived here, Daddy?" "A young, happy carpenter who married in 1908 and moved in here with his sweet young wife and made cupboards, tables, and chairs, and sofas for her exactly as she wanted them, and kissed her madly and said, 'It shall be called Carpenter's cottage, and it shall be our home on earth.'" Malin stared at him. "Do you know all that, or are you just making it up?" Melker smiled a little shyly. Yes, it's something I made up, although I shouldn't wonder if it isn't true." "Well," said Malin, "at any rate, there must have been someone once long ago who was happy with this furniture, and polished and dusted it and spring-cleaned it. Who does the house belong to?" Melker thought for a moment. "Someone called Miss Schborg and Miss Schablum, or something like that. An old lady. Perhaps she's your carpenter's wife," said Malin, laughing. "She lives in Neustadt and at present," said Melker. "A man called Matson acts as her agent and rents the place during the summer. It looks to me as if it has been rented mostly to vandals with very destructive little children." He looked around at what had once, no doubt, been a very pleasant living room. It was not very beautiful now, but Melker was quite content. "This," he said, "this is going to be our sitting room," and he patted the whitewashed stove. "We'll sit here in the evenings in front of the wood fire, listening to the storm outside, while our ears flap in the draught," said Malin, and pointed to the window, where one of the panes was broken. She still had her little anxiety frown between her eyes. But Melcher, who had already taken Carpenter's cottage to his heart, was not worried about a cracked window. "Don't fuss, my dear. Your clever father will put in a new pane of glass tomorrow. Don't you worry." Malin did not stop worrying altogether, for she knew Melcher, and she thought with a mixture of impatience and tenderness, "He thinks he will be able to do it, he really does, but he forgets what usually happens. If he tries to put in a new pane of glass, it means 3 more will be broken. I must ask that man Nissi Gronkvist if there is anyone who can help me." Aloud she said, "Now I think it's time we got down to it. Did you say you were going to light the kitchen stove, Daddy?" Melcher rubbed his hands together, full of business. "Just that. You can't leave that sort of thing to women and children." "Well then," said Malin, "the women and children will go to look for the well. I hope there is such a thing." She heard the boys tramping around upstairs and shouted to them, "Come on, boys, we must fetch some water." The rain had stopped for the moment at any rate. The evening sun was making brave but futile attempts to break through the clouds, eagerly encouraged by the blackbird in the old white-beam tree. He went on singing regardless until he saw the Melkerson children come out into the wet grass with their water pails. Then he stopped. "Isn't it wonderful that Carpenter's cottage has its own guardian tree?" said Malin, and touched the white beam with loving tenderness as she passed it. "What are guardian trees for?" asked Pele. "To be loved," said Malin. "To climb, can't you see," said Johann. "And that will be the first thing we do tomorrow morning," Nicholas declared. "I wonder if Daddy had to pay extra because there's a fabulous climbing tree." Malin laughed at that, but the boys continued to think of things they thought Melcher should pay extra for: the jetty and the rowboat, which was moored to it, the attic, which they had already investigated and which was full of exciting things, "and the well, if it's fairly good water," suggested Malin, but that Johann and Nicholas did not think could be considered worth paying extra for. Johann pulled up the first pailful, and Pele gave a shriek of delight. "Look, there's a tiny frog at the bottom." A little groan of anguish came from Malin. Pele looked at her in surprise. "What's the matter? Don't you like frogs?" "Not in drinking water," said Malin. But Pele jumped about in excitement. "Oh, can I have it?" he said. Then he turned to Johann. "Do you think Daddy had to pay extra for frogs in the well?" "Depends on how many there are," said Johann. "If there are lots, I expect he's been let off cheap." He looked at Malin to see how much frog she could stand, but it did not look as if she had heard. Malin's thoughts had wandered off in another direction. She was thinking about the gay carpenter and his wife. Had they lived happily in their carpenter's cottage? Had they had lots of children who, one by one, had begun to climb in the white beam and perhaps had fallen into the sea now and then? Were there just as many wild rose bushes in the garden in June then as now? And was the path to the well white with fallen apple blossoms then as now? Then she suddenly remembered that the gay carpenter and his wife had been dreamed up by Melcher, but she decided to believe in them all the same. She decided one more thing. However many frogs there were in the well, however many broken window panes, however dilapidated Carpenter's cottage was, nothing would stop her from being happy here and now, for now it was summer. It should always be a June evening, she thought, dreamy and still like this one, and quiet. Beyond the jetty the seagulls circled, and now and then one of them uttered a wild shriek or two, but otherwise this unbelievable silence which seemed to tingle in their ears. A thin mist of rain lay over the sea, and it was lovely in a melancholy way. Drops of water fell from the bushes and trees, and there was the feel of more rain in the air, and of earth and salt water and wet grass. Sit out in the garden in the sunshine and eat our supper and feel that summer has come. That was what Melker had imagined doing on their first evening at Carpenter's cottage. This was something quite different, but it was still summer. Malin felt that so strongly that tears came to her eyes, but she felt hungry too, and she wondered how far Melker had got with the kitchen stove. He had not got very far. "Malin, where are you?" he yelled, as he always did as soon as anything went wrong. But Malin was out of hearing, and he realized reluctantly that he was alone and would have to manage by himself. Alone with my God and an iron stove, which is shortly to be heaved out the window, he murmured bitterly, but then he had to cough and could not say more. He glared at the stove, which did nothing but angrily billow out smoke at him, although he had done it no harm, apart from lighting a fire in it with great tenderness and care. He raked the fire with the poker, and a fresh cloud of smoke billowed out over him. Coughing wildly, he rushed to open all the windows, and just as he had done that, the door opened and someone came in. It was the majestic child who had been standing on the jetty when they arrived. The child with the strange name Corvin or Jorvin, or whatever it was. She looked like a well-fed sausage, thought Melker, round and wholesome. The face which was visible under the slicker was, as far as he could see through the smoke, a particularly clear, charming child's face, broad and good-humored, with a pair of bright, inquiring eyes. She had the enormous dog with her, which seemed even more colossal indoors than out. He seemed to fill the whole kitchen. Jorvin had stopped on the threshold. "It's smoking," she said. "You don't say," replied Melker bitterly. "I hadn't noticed." Then he coughed until tears came into his eyes. "Yes, it is," Jorvin assured him. "Do you know what? Perhaps there's a dead owl in the chimney. We had one once." Then she looked curiously at Melker and smiled broadly. "Your face is black all over." Melker coughed. "I'm a kipper of freshly smoked herring. You can call me Uncle Melker." "Oh, is that your name?" said Jorvin. Melker did not have to answer, for luckily Malin and the boys came back at that moment. "Daddy, we found a frog in the well," said Pele eagerly. But then he forgot all about frogs because of the fantastic dog which he had seen on the jetty a short while ago, and which was now standing in his own kitchen. Melker looked hurt. A frog in the well, really? That agent said this was a homey little summer residence, but he forgot to tell me that it was a zoo with owls in the chimney and frogs in the well, and giant dogs in the kitchen. Johann, go and see if there's an elk in the bedroom. His children laughed as they were expected to. Melker would have been hurt otherwise, but Malin said, "Oh dear, it's smoking." "Are you surprised?" said Melker. He pointed accusingly at the iron stove. "I am going to write to the Enkarsrum foundry to complain about the stove. I'm going to say you delivered an iron stove in April 1908, which is a disgrace to you. What do you mean by it?" No one was listening except Malin. The others had crowded round Jorvin and her dog, and were plying her with questions. Jorvin told them kindly that she lived in the next house to Carpenter's cottage. Her father had a shop there, but the house was so large that there was room for them all, me and Bosun and Mummy and Daddy and Teddy and Freddie. "How old are Teddy and Freddie?" asked Johann eagerly. "Teddy is 13, and Freddie is 12, and I am 6, and Bosun is 2. I can't remember how old Mummy and Daddy are, but I can go home and ask," she said obligingly. Johann assured her that this was not necessary. He and Nicholas looked at each other happily. The two boys exactly their own age in the house next door. It was almost too good to be true. What in the world are we going to do if we can't get this stove to work? Wondered Malin. Melker tore his hair. I suppose I'd better get up on the roof to see if there really is a dead owl in the chimney, as that child suggested. Oh dear, said Malin, be careful. Remember, we've only got one father. But Melker was already outside the door. He had seen that there was a ladder against the wall, so that it ought not to be too difficult for him to get up onto the roof. His boys followed him, even Pele. Not even the world's largest dog could keep him in the kitchen when Daddy was going to get owls out of the chimney, and Jorvin, who had already selected Pele as her friend and follower, although Pele did not know it, strolled out after them in a leisurely way to see if anything amusing was going to happen. It looks as if it might be fun, she thought. Uncle Melker had taken the poker with him to try to get the owl out, and he was having to hold it between his teeth while he climbed up the ladder. Exactly like Bosun when he fetches a bone, thought Jorvin. She could not imagine anything more amusing than that, and she laughed quietly to herself under the apple tree where she stood. Then one of the rungs gave way, and Uncle Melker slid down a couple of feet. Pele was frightened, but Jorvin laughed again, silently and heartily. Then she stopped laughing, for now Uncle Melker was up on the roof, and she thought it looked dangerous. Melker thought so too. This is a nice house, he murmured, but rather high. He began to wonder if it were not a little too high to balance on for someone who would soon be 50. If I ever live to be that old, he muttered, and wobbled along the ridge of the roof with his eyes glued to the chimney. Then he cast a glance downward, and almost fell when he saw his sons' upturned, anxious faces so far below him. Hold on, Daddy, shrieked Johann. Melker staggered and almost lost his temper. Above him was nothing but the open sky. What was he to hold on to? Then from down below he heard Jorvin's penetrating voice. Tell you what, Uncle Melker, hold on with the crook of the poker. But now Melker had happily reached safety next to the chimney. He looked down into it. There was nothing there but murky darkness. Hey, Jorvin, you said something about owls, dead ones, he yelled. There aren't any owls up here, not even an old shriek owl, called Nicholas. Then Melker shouted angrily, there aren't any owls up here, I've already said so. And again he heard Jorvin's penetrating voice. Do you want one? I know where there is one, but he isn't dead. Afterwards the atmosphere in the kitchen was a little strained. We'll have to live out of cans for the time being, said Malin. They all gazed sadly at the stove, which would not behave itself. Just now there seemed nothing they would rather have had than a little warm food. It's a hard life, said Pele, because his father used to say that sometimes. Then there was a knock on the door, and in came a strange woman in a red raincoat. She hastily put down an enamel saucepan on the stove and smiled a great big smile at all of them. Good evening. Oh, there you are, Jorvin. I thought so. How badly it's smoking, she said. And before anyone could do anything, she went on, I'd better tell you who I am. My name is Marta Gronkvist. We are next-door neighbors. Welcome. She spoke quickly and smiled the whole time, and before anyone in the family noticed, she had crossed to the stove and was looking up into the chimney. Have you opened the damper? It would be better if you had. Malin burst out laughing, but Melker looked hurt. Yes, of course, I opened the damper. It was the first thing I did, he assured them. Well, it's closed now, said Marta Gronkvist. And now it's open, she said as she turned it around. Probably it was open when you came and Mr. Meckelerson shut it. He's always so careful, said Malin. They all laughed, even Melker, and most of all Jorvin. I know this stove, said Marta Gronkvist, and it's first-rate. Malin looked at her thankfully. Everything seemed so much better since this wonderful person had come into the kitchen. She was so gay and spread a feeling of security around her. What luck to have her as a neighbor, thought Malin. I made a little stew to welcome you, said Marta Gronqvist, and pointed to the saucepan. The tears came to Melker's eyes. That often happened when people were nice to him and his children. To think that there are such kind people, he stammered. Yes, we're all kind here on Seacrow Island, laughed Marta Gronqvist. Come on, Jorvin, we must go home now. If there's anything more you need, just tell me. Well, there is a cracked window pane in there, said Malin shyly, but we can't ask too much. I'll send niece over later when you've eaten, said Marta Gronqvist. Yes, because it's him who puts in all the window panes on Seacrow Island, said Jorvin, and it's me and Stina who break them. What did you say? Said her mother sternly. But never on purpose, of course, Jorvin hastened to explain. It just happens like that. Stina, I know her, said Pelle. Do you? Said Jorvin, and for some reason she did not seem very pleased. Pelle had been strangely quiet for a long time. Why bother to talk to people when there was a dog like Bosun in the room? Pelle was hanging around his neck, and he whispered in his ear, I like you. And Bosun let himself be hugged. He just looked at Pelle with friendly, rather sad eyes, with a gaze that bared the whole of his steadfast dog's soul for anyone who cared to see. But now Jorvin was going home, and where Jorvin went, Bosun went too. Come on, Bosun, she said, and then they were gone. But the kitchen window was open, and they all heard Jorvin's voice as she went past outside. Mummy, do you know what? When we walked on the roof, Uncle Melker held on with the poker. They heard Marta Gronqvist's reply, too. They come from the town, you see, Jorvin, and I suppose they have to hold on with pokers. The Melkersons all looked at one another. She's sorry for us, said Johann. She needn't be. But as far as the stove was concerned, Marta was quite right. It was splendid and burned so briskly that it soon became glowingly red and spread wonderful warmth through the whole kitchen. The blessed fire of the house, said Melker. Humans had no home until they discovered fire, and found out about stews, said Nicholas, and began to eat so that he could say no more. They sat around the kitchen table and ate, and it was a time of deep, comfortable hominess. The fire roared in the stove, and the rain roared outside. It was raining harder than ever when Johann and Nicholas went to bed. Unwillingly they left the warm kitchen and went up to their attic, which was cold and damp and very unpleasant in spite of the fire in the stove. But Pelle was already asleep there, wrapped in blankets and with a warm cap on his head, pulled well down. Johann stood shivering at the window and tried to see over the Gronqvist, their neighbors. But the rain was so heavy that it was like looking through a dense curtain of streaming water. Shop he could make out the sign, and the house that was red just like their own cottage, and the garden sloped down toward the sea, and there was a boat jetty just like their own. Tomorrow we may be able to make friends with those boys, who said Johann. But then he suddenly stopped, for something was happening over at their neighbor's house. A door opened, and someone came running out into the rain. It was a girl in a bathing suit, and her fair hair streamed behind her as she galloped down toward the jetty. Come here, Nicholas. Something interesting for you to see, said Johann. Then he stopped again, for now the door was opening again, and another girl came out. She was in a swimsuit, too, and she galloped down toward the jetty after the other one. The first girl was already there. She dove in, and as soon as her nose was above water, again she shrieked, "Freddie, did you bring the soap?" Johann and Nicholas looked at each other. "Those are the boys we were going to see tomorrow," said Nicholas at last. "Oh dear," said Johann. They lay awake for a long time that evening. "You can't possibly get to sleep until your feet have thawed at least a little bit," said Nicholas. Johann agreed. Then they went silent for a long time. "Well, at any rate, it's stopped raining now," said Johann finally. "No, it hasn't," said Nicholas. "It's only just begun over here in my bed. Either you like it when it rains in through the ceiling, or you don't." Nicholas did not exactly like it dripping down on his bed, but it didn't bother him too much, for he was only 12 years old and rather easy-going by nature. On the other hand, both he and Johann realized that Malin would have a sleepless night if they reported this misery to her just now, so they moved Nicholas's bed very quietly to one side and put a pail to catch the drips from the ceiling. "That noise makes you sleepy," mumbled Johann, when he had got back to bed again. Plop, plop. Downstairs, Malin sat blissfully, ignorant of the plopping, and wrote in her diary, for she wanted to remember the first day on Seacrow Island. "I am sitting here alone," she finally wrote, "but it feels as if someone is watching me. Not a person, just a house, Carpenter's cottage, Carpenter's cottage. Do please like us. You'd better make up your mind to it, because you are going to have to put up with us. You don't know who we are yet, you say. I'll tell you. That tall, gangling fellow who is lying in bed in the little room by the kitchen and spouting poetry aloud to send himself to sleep is Melker. You must guard against him, particularly if you see him with a hammer or a saw or some other tool in his hand. Otherwise he is very nice and quite harmless. As for the 3 scruffy little boys in one of the attics, I hope you are fond of children and are used to all sorts of going-ons. I suppose the carpenter's children could not always have been so very good. The person who is going to clean your windows and scrub your floors with love, but with more and more roughened hands, is yours truly, Malin. Although I'll make the others help too, you can be sure of that. We'll all try to make everything look its best here. Good night, Carpenter's cottage. We'd better go to sleep now. A cold attic is waiting for me too, but you can be sure of my staying down here a little longer, in this nice warm kitchen with its glowing range, for here I feel in touch with your warmly beating heart." Then Malin suddenly noticed how late it was. A new day had already begun, a day in which the rain had stopped, so that it would be bright and clear, and she saw when she went to the window. She stood there for a long time. "What a wonderful kitchen window," she murmured, and she knew that she had never seen anything she liked better than what she saw outside. The still water in the light of dawn, the jetty, the gray stones on the shore, everything. She opened the window and heard the bird song which jubilantly wafted in over her. It issued from a host of small throats, but above them all she could hear the blackbird in the white beam. He had just wakened and was full of the joy of life, and poor Melker in the little room by the kitchen was still not asleep, but he yawned. Malin could hear that. He was still reciting poetry in a loud voice. She felt that he was happy.